Good evening. Welcome. It's exciting to see everyone here. This is the second time that I've introduced to you the Beloit College community, Richard Bernstein, Veralist Professor of Philosophy and former Dean of the Graduate Faculty of the New School. The last time was 10 years ago, this month, when Bernstein came to Beloit to speak as a Phi Beta Kappa speaker. Raise your hand if you were here at that meeting. Most of you were not here then, and most of what I said then is still true, so I'll say it again. I would like to say that introducing Bernstein gives me great pleasure. Unfortunately, I'm not fond of public speaking, and I speak now under some duress. It's obvious that I ought to say something about what this man has meant to me, personally and philosophically. And for the second time in a decade, duty won out over my inclinations, and I volunteered to introduce him. So my remarks may be shorter than Professor Bernstein deserves, perhaps, but longer than gives me pleasure. Richard Bernstein is among a small number of philosophers who have risen above narrow specializations to become public intellectuals and world citizens. Throughout his long career, he's been a voice of reason as he sought to bridge disparate schools of philosophy, disparate nationalities, and eventually even disparate disciplines, and bring them into conversation with one another. Like Socrates, he has committed himself to developing and examining the views of others. And only through this dialectical process does his own philosophy begin to emerge. And what emerges again and again is his commitment to reasoning as an open-ended, practical, and ethical task. Bernstein was born in Brooklyn in 1932 to second-generation Jewish family that was, in his own words, not particularly academic or intellectual. He went to University of Chicago when he was 17 and graduated with a BA 2 years later. This was at the end of the Hutchins era, and I think we can safely assume he was part of what was once called the largest collection of neurotic youth since the Children's Crusades. Undergraduates there still boast about placing dead last several years ago in a national ranking of best party schools. And they wear sweatshirts that say, University of Chicago, where fun goes to die. I would know. I was there myself for graduate school in the late 1980s. Bernstein eventually went to Yale to do graduate work in philosophy and received his MA in 1955 and his PhD in 1958. After writing his dissertation on John Dewey's Metaphysics of Experience in 1971, he published The Praxis in Action, an ambitious work weaving together themes from four contemporary philosophical traditions that rarely spoke to one another: Marxism, existentialism, pragmatism, and analytic philosophy, and showing that while each had its own distinctive strengths and weaknesses, they were also each moving towards an increased attention to praxis and action. In The Restructuring of Social and Political Theory, which came out 6 years later, Bernstein showed the philosophical significance of the crisis of method arising in the social sciences, and through a characteristically patient and subtle analysis, he steered a judicious course between the despairing and reactionary voices. He concludes that, quote, an adequate social and political theory must be empirical, interpretive, and critical. In 1983, he wrote Beyond Objectivism and Relativism, Science, Hermeneutics, and Praxis. He argues that there may not be a general theoretical defense against skepticism and the specter of relativism that can be laid out in advance, but neither is there a general theoretical support for the pernicious inference that truth and reasoning are obsolete and do not have an ongoing role to play. In conclusion, Bernstein writes, the movement beyond objectivism and relativism is not just a theoretical problem, but a practical task. In The New Constellation, The Ethical Political Horizons of Modernity, Postmodernity, written in 1992, Bernstein examines a number of postmodern and post-structuralist thinkers and suggests that the rage against reason and the attack against humanism is ultimately unpersuasive, as these same writers employ reasoning of powerful and subtle kinds and orient their deconstructions on behalf of the modern Enlightenment values of human liberation. In this sense, he argues that postmodernity is more of an extension of modernity than a decisive break from it. Professor Bernstein first met Hannah Arendt after writing Praxis in Action in 1972. While I was a student at Haverford in 1980 to 82, I remember him describing his discussions with her as exciting and stormy. She encouraged him to come join the graduate faculty at the New School, but it wasn't until 16 years later, several years after she had died, that Bernstein finally left Haverford and became the chair of the graduate faculty of the New School. He sought to build up the program's international reputation in continental philosophy, and more recently has endeavored to continue Arendt's work on evil as well. In 1996, he published Hannah Arendt and the Jewish Question, and in 2002, he followed with Radical Evil, a philosophical interrogation. Following Levinas, Bernstein argues that it's a temptation to try to give a theoretical explanation of evil. Facing evil, somewhat like moving beyond objectivism and relativism, must be an ongoing, practical task. Bernstein has authored 5 additional books that I won't describe here. Professor Bernstein is a philosopher's philosopher. The year after he last visited Beloit, MIT Press published an edited volume examining his work, with articles by Richard Rorty, Jacques Derrida, Nancy Fraser, Jürgen Habermas, and Charles Taylor. I was not invited to participate. So like the drunken Alcibiades, I'll have to crash this esteemed symposium and offer a tribute of my own. My own experience with Bernstein began when I took a Wittgenstein seminar with him at Haverford College in the spring of 1981. He didn't come lecture about Wittgenstein's ideas. He'd become Wittgenstein. He brought Wittgenstein alive. This was especially disconcerting later in other classes, when like a chameleon, he did the same thing with Plato and Hegel. Though for reasons that should become clear tonight, Descartes was rather hard to revive. Bernstein had a special Socratic talent for listening carefully and responding in a way that addressed what you were trying to say on its own terms. He was the most inspiring teacher that I ever had. In a line Jack Nicholson stole from Alcibiades, he made me want to be a better man. Though I have also my complaints of how Bernstein abused me. When I presented the first draft of my senior thesis, he told me that I was going in with a hatchet when I should be using a scalpel. From the expression on his face, I was reminded of what Socrates said: writing badly does not only do harm as far as language goes, but it corrupts the soul. After I left Haverford, when I read Bernstein's books, they were so persuasive to me that I had trouble finding anything to disagree with. Yet the abuse continued, as he encouraged me to be a carpenter instead of a philosopher. He had me repairing the steps outside of his home and fixing his leaking toilet. See if he denies it. And on rereading some of his work these past couple months, even books from the 1970s and 80s, I still find that they hold up extremely well. I cannot quite decide whether this is because everything he said was true and the truth wears well, or because I'm like among those who have been enchanted by this flute-playing satyr. And now, like Socrates, he'll smile ironically and deny teaching us anything. Tonight, Bernstein will give a talk based on his most recent book entitled The Pragmatic Turn. Please welcome Professor Richard Bernstein.
That really was a lovely introduction. But I think that the moral you might have drawn, if you live long enough, you write a lot of books. Anyway, it's nice to be back in Beloit, and as I was saying even at dinner, being in a place like Beloit is for me, coming home. I spent many, many years at a college which is like Beloit, Haverford College. I'm a great believer, and I think it's even more urgent today than it is at places like Beloit. Liberal arts colleges should thrive and survive here. So it's nice to be in a place where people are friendly, where you can talk, where there's intelligence, and where there's a kind of real concern with fundamental issues. So thank Phil and the others for inviting me. Okay. I am going to talk about the pragmatic turn, although somebody asked me before where I was teaching, and I was sort of shocked when I realized that what I'm teaching this semester is a graduate course on violence and an undergraduate course on evil. But tonight, I'm not going to talk about those subjects. Tonight, I want to tell a story. I think it's a fascinating and complex story, filled with colorful characters and a certain amount of drama. And it is our story, and I include you. It is an American story, but one that is barely known and not fully appreciated. It's a story of the origins of American pragmatism, the history of its vicissitudes, and its current state of international resurgence. The word pragmatic has become an everyday word, and everyone has a vague idea of what it's supposed to mean. To be pragmatic is to be eminently practical. To know what the real world is really like and to adapt to its realities. Indeed, if you're really pragmatic, you're not going to study philosophy. Okay? Sometimes it's contrasted with ideology, as when some politicians are rigidly ideological and others are claimed to be more pragmatic. It's hard to pick up a newspaper, or at least a newspaper in the East, without seeing some reference to some politician, or including our president, who is supposed to be pragmatic. And indeed, there is a book on the books of Obama, not the president, but the two books that he wrote before he became president, called Reading Obama, which argues and claims that the greatest influence on Barack Obama are the American pragmatists. Turns out, as one of my students pointed out in that book, on page 33, and there's a description of Bernstein saying that Obama, this is before he's president, that his views are closest to mine. When I read that, and the student asked me, is that true? I said, well, at least it's true in its description of my views. Anyway, I'm going to call this general sense of pragmatic the common or the vulgar sense of pragmatism. And I hope to show you that it has very little, although something, to do with the great American philosophical tradition of pragmatism that was initiated by Charles S. Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. So when does our story begin? Well, we have one important clue. We know the precise date when the word was introduced to designate a philosophical orientation. On August 26, 1898, William James, who was an immensely popular lecturer, delivered an address before the Philosophical Union at the University of California at Berkeley, entitled Philosophical Conceptions and Practical Results. And this is the way he began. This is James's wonderful prose. An occasion like the present would seem to call for an absolutely untechnical discourse. I ought to give a message with a practical outcome and an emotional accompaniment, so to speak, fitted to the interest of men as men. This is a time when all human beings are referred to as men. And yet also not altogether to disappoint for philosophers, since philosophers, let them be as queer as they will, still are human beings in the secret recesses of their hearts, even here in Berkeley. And James goes on to declare, philosophers, after all, like poets, they are pathfinders who blaze new trails in the forest. And after this initial flourish, James introduces the word pragmatism. He writes, I will seek to define with you what seems to be the most likely direction in which to start upon the trail of truth. Years ago, this direction was given to me by an American philosopher whose home is in the East and whose published works, few as they are scattered in periodicals, are not a fit expression of his powers. I refer to Mr. Charles S. Peirce, with whose very existence as a philosopher, I dare say many of you are unacquainted. He is one of the most original contemporary thinkers, and the principle of practicalism, or pragmatism, as he called it, when I first heard it enunciated in Cambridge in the early 1870s, is the clue or compass by following which I find myself more and more confirmed in believing we may keep our feet on a proper trail. This was the first philosophical introduction of the word pragmatism to name a philosophical orientation. And it is the first narrative account of the origin of American pragmatism. Now, somehow the term pragmatism caught on internationally, and James's view were widely discussed and frequently severely criticized. And 10 years after he gave this address in Berkeley, James published his book, Pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking, in which he gives a fuller account of the origins of the meaning of pragmatism. He writes, the term is derived from the Greek word pragma, meaning action, and from which our words practice and practical come. It was introduced into philosophy by Mr. Charles Peirce in 1878 in an article entitled How to Make Our Ideas Clear. Mr. Peirce, after pointing out that our beliefs are really rules for action, said that to develop a thought's meaning, we need only determine what conduct it is fitted to produce, and that conduct is for us its sole significance. And the tangible fact at the root of all thought distinctions, however subtle, is that there is not one of them, no one of them, so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference in practice. But let us continue to follow our clues. I'm going to drink some water. I understand that last night Rubio, when he was giving his answer to Obama, drank some water, and this became the main topic on Twitter about drinking. So maybe this will become a main topic if Bernstein has a drink of water. So let's follow the clues. When James tells us that he heard that the principle of pragmatism enunciated in the 1870s, he is referring to what was called the Metaphysical Club. What was a Metaphysical Club? It really was an informal discussion group of outstanding intellectuals, which included not only James and Peirce, but also Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., who was to become one of the greatest of our Supreme Court justices. And several years ago, Louis Menand wrote a book entitled The Metaphysical Club, which won a Pulitzer Prize, in which he follows the ideas and careers of Charles S. Peirce, William James, John Dewey, and Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. And here's what he has to say about the ideas that seem to be generated in this group. Their ideas changed the way Americans thought and continue to think about education, about democracy, about liberty, justice, and tolerance. And as a consequence, they changed the way that Americans live, the way they learn, the way they express themselves, and the way they treat people different from themselves. We are still living, he's writing this about 10 or 15 years ago, to a great extent in a country that these thinkers helped to make. That's from Menand's book, The Metaphysical Club. But who precisely was Charles S. Peirce? The person that James declared to be one of the most original contemporary philosophers and who is credited as being the founder of pragmatism. Peirce, the son of a distinguished Harvard mathematician, is, in my opinion, the greatest philosophical genius that America has ever produced. And today, he's still barely known and appreciated. He led an extremely troubled and in some ways self-destructive life. He was recognized for his talent and genius by the best philosophers in America, including William James, John Dewey, and Josiah Royce. But he was never able to secure a permanent academic position. For many years, he worked for the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey, and when he was dismissed from that position, he barely survived writing reviews, and he died sick with cancer and extreme poverty. He always thought of himself primarily as a logician and an experimental scientist. He could sit at his desk writing for a 24-hour stretch. And during the last years of his life, he had to burn his furniture to keep he, himself, and his wife warm. Sometimes he'd go for days with scarcely any food to eat. And during his lifetime, he did not publish a great deal, but he worked relentlessly. If all his unpublished manuscripts were published today, and they're still not yet all published, they would fill about 100 volumes. He dealt with subjects ranging from logic, mathematics, the gamut of the natural sciences, the history of science, linguistics, semiotics, medieval philosophy, and much more. And despite the effort of friends like James to get him an academic position, Peirce, who could be arrogant, disdainful towards mediocrity, flamboyant in his lifestyle, and indifferent to social conventions, was blackballed from the academic establishment. Now, although they remained lifelong friends, the temperaments and philosophical interests of James and Peirce could not have been more different. Both Peirce and James, who became a professor of philosophy at Harvard, James was a professor, were very much part of a thriving intellectual culture that centered in Cambridge in the post-Civil War years. Peirce was born in 1839 and James in 1842. Now, the third member that I'm going to talk about, there are many more, but the third that I'm going to focus on, of the classical pragmatists that I want to consider, is John Dewey. Born in 1859, the year of the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, Dewey's background was very different from that of Peirce and James. Peirce was the son of a Harvard mathematician who was trained by his father to be a prodigy. And William James came from one of the most remarkably talented families in America. Dewey, unlike them, was the son of a modest New England tradesman and grew up in Burlington, Vermont. And Burlington, at that time, like other New England towns, was governed by a local town meeting in which all citizens could participate. We must remember that graduate education was only just coming into existence at the end of the 19th century. And Dewey, after teaching high school for a year, borrowed funds from a relative to attend one of the first institutions in America to grant a PhD, Johns Hopkins. Dewey was a relatively modest person, but he eventually became the most influential philosopher and public intellectual in America. Now, this brief sketch gives an idea of the main characters of what we call classical American pragmatism. But before I turn to discussion of their ideas, I want to say something about the setting, the intellectual milieu of the late 19th century, because it deeply shaped their thinking. We have a tendency to think that academic disciplines, as we know them today, have always more or less existed in the same shape. It's not true, but this is simply not true. In the main, higher education in the United States consisted primarily of liberal arts colleges. A liberal arts college such as Beloit is closer to what higher education was like throughout the United States than our great research universities today. Graduate schools awarding PhDs in separate fields did not exist. Indeed, intellectual life spanned the range of human knowledge. I've already mentioned that Peirce was a mathematician, logician, and experimental scientist who had a curiosity and wrote an enormous number of diverse topics. James, who always had artistic inclinations, although he was trained as a doctor. Initially, he was most famous for his work on psychology. And when he was first appointed to Harvard, he taught physiology. Then he became a professor of psychology, and ultimately, finally, was appointed a professor of philosophy. I've always found it striking that Peirce and James, two of the founders of American pragmatism, never formally studied philosophy. Of course, they were reading philosophy as adolescents, even before they entered college. But neither majored in philosophy as an undergraduate, or did they receive a PhD in the field of philosophy. The intellectual milieu of these times was radically different from what it is today. The life of the mind spanned what we take to be separate and sometimes isolated disciplines. Today, we might say that they were interdisciplinary thinkers, but this would be misleading because fixed disciplines, as we know them today, separated off from each other, simply did not exist. Dewey did pursue a PhD in philosophy and was originally inspired by Hegel. But when he was appointed to the University of Chicago in 1892, his title was Professor of Philosophy, Psychology, and Pedagogy. Now, why is this all so important? I think that part of the richness of the American pragmatic tradition is that it was informed by a breadth of concern. This was still a time when thinkers thought that they could arrange over all of human knowledge, and that indeed it was their obligation to know something about all aspects of the human disciplines. And furthermore, there's another aspect that added to their richness. Many of the divisions that we sometimes see in philosophy for them simply did not exist. The philosophers that inspired them, they were very different. Peirce claimed to know, and knowing Peirce's capabilities, I could believe it, although it sounds insane, that he knew the Kant's Critique of Pure Reason by heart. Okay, James always felt a closer affinity with the British empiricists. And he even dedicated pragmatism to J.S. Mill. And Dewey, as I mentioned, really started as a Hegelian. Consequently, there's a richness and diversity of philosophic orientations woven into classical pragmatism. But let's turn to the ideas of these thinkers. Now, I'm going to present a composite picture with some dominant themes. And I want to single out 6 interrelated themes that I think are characteristic of these pragmatic thinkers. The first theme is anti-foundationalism and the critique of Cartesianism. Descartes, in his Meditations, was searching for a solid foundation for the edifice of knowledge, something that is indubitable and incorrigible, a truth that can be known with certainty and that could serve as the real basis or foundation for knowledge. Descartes is haunted by what I have called, in some of my writings, the Cartesian anxiety, the grand either-or. Either there is some support for our being, a fixed foundation for our knowledge, or we cannot escape the forces of darkness that envelop us with madness and intellectual and moral chaos. Now, there is a way of reading the good deal of philosophy from its beginning to its present, and especially from Descartes to the present, as a search for a firm foundation. Whether we take the foundation to be the intellectual grasp of eternal forms, or the direct grasp of immediate empirical intuitions, or the cogito itself. The appeal for such a basic rock-bottom foundation cannot be underestimated. In our time, the failure to discover, quote, such a foundation is said to lead right to a straight defeating relativism that denies the very foundation of truth, objectivity, and moral validity. And there is, I think, unfortunately, to a great extent, that still infects a good deal of popular consciousness. If I don't have something basically to believe in, then anything goes in different sorts of ways. Now, the pragmatists, all of them, I think, challenge this way of thinking, challenge this kind of grand either-or. They seek to exorcise the Cartesian anxiety. They reject the idea that there is an absolute grounding or foundation of our being. I think one of the best statements of the Pragmatic Alternative was succinctly stated by Wilfrid Sellars when he writes, I quote him, "For empirical knowledge, like its sophisticated extension science, is rational, not because it has a foundation, but because it's a self-correcting enterprise that can put any claim into jeopardy, although not all at once." The alternative to the foundation metaphor is to think of inquiry as a self-correcting enterprise that has no fixed absolute beginning points and no absolute end. This alternative paradigm, this alternative way of thinking, leads me to the second theme that I think is characteristic of the pragmatic tradition, and that's the theme of fallibilism. If inquiry is a self-corrective activity that can put any claim into jeopardy, then this means that all knowledge claims, indeed all validity claims, are fallible in the sense that we never can claim that we know anything with a type of certainty that cannot in principle be questioned. There is a difference between indubitability and fallibility. Many of our beliefs are indubitable in the sense that we do not doubt them, and indeed may not even be aware that we have such beliefs. But what is indubitable today may turn out to be false tomorrow. Furthermore, fallibilism is not to be confused with epistemological skepticism. Hilary Putnam, who was one of the outstanding pragmatists of all time and still alive, once wrote that the great contribution of the pragmatists is to show that fallibilism and anti-skepticism are compatible. Peirce, for example, never doubted that we can know a reality that is independent of ourselves. But he also argued we're never in a position to claim that we know this with absolute certainty. And I think we can illustrate what is meant by anti-foundationalism and fallibilism by an appeal to an understanding of scientific inquiry, although we could relate it to all kinds of inquiry. The validity of a given theory or explanatory hypothesis in any of the sciences is not dependent on showing that it rests on an absolute foundation, but rather that it's supported by the best empirical evidence and the best reasoning. Every serious scientist today knows that our current theories and hypotheses will most likely be modified or even abandoned in light of further inquiry and evidence. So strictly speaking, what we take to be true today may turn out to be false. It would be hyperbolic to say that consequently we don't really have any knowledge, because any knowledge claim that we make may turn out to be false. Rather, the pragmatic point is that all knowledge is fallible, and all knowledge is corrigible. In principle, it can be corrected. Now, there's also a broader sense in which we can speak about fallibility as an ethical and political virtue. A fallibilistic mentality is one cultivated disposition to be open to other points of view, to have the imagination to transpose ourselves into understanding persons and ideas that are genuinely radically different from us, and to have the courage and the humility to enlarge our horizons in light of new evidence and new encounters with others. The question arises, if we cannot know anything with absolute certainty, then how to warrant and secure our knowledge claims? And answering this will bring me to the third theme, the importance of the community of inquirers and the sociality of our practices that shape us. Before I get to the third point, I want to take a slight diversion, because for me, you see, philosophical ideas always have ultimately practical significance. And so I tell you a story about something I mentioned in a book that Phil did not mention. In the year 2000, in August 2001, I finished a book which was a philosophical attempt to understand what philosophers thought about the nature of evil and radical evil. 11 days later, you all know what happened. And suddenly, evil was all over the place. Indeed, on that very first day, George W. Bush had said that today we have faced evil in the world. I was now a very popular figure. I was constantly being invited to speak at symposia on the concept of evil, and I got angrier and angrier. And I said to my editor, the next time I give a talk, I'm going to talk about the abuse of evil. Well, and he says, we have a new series in Polity. Would you write a short book? I said, I don't know if I have enough to say, but I thought, and I wrote a short book called The Abuse of Evil. The subtitle is The Corruption of Politics and Religion Since 9/11. And what is it that angered me? What angered me was that when you had a crisis like this, there was a slippage back into a simple binary opposition. We are the good guys. Those guys over there, Saddam Hussein, they're the evil ones. And there was a kind of confidence. There was also a religious dimension to this, which is we who have religious faith, we know what evil is when we stare it in the face. Anybody who would raise any kind of questions about this was immediately being shut off. I thought this is an abuse of the concept of evil, and I opposed it to what I call the radical, to the pragmatic fallibility. It's in that sense, I mean, the kind of openness, a kind of willingness to inquire without, evil was being used to stop thinking, not really sort of to elicit thinking. So it seems to me still, when people maintain, I know where I stand, this is where it is, whether it be a religious stand or a secular stand, I don't care. And this is what's true with kind of absolute certainty. I know it. And that is the basis of my ground that invites a kind of mentality which I think is anti-fallibilistic. And what I wanted to show is it's perfectly consistent to hold to fallibilism and to have strong convictions. The idea, if you remember this kind of thing in the rhetoric that was going on, anybody who questioned these things was feminized, you know, these tough, I won't go into it, tough people on the one side and these wishy-washy other people on the other kind of side, as if you didn't have an absolute grounding, then you were wishy-washy. This is exactly what I try to defeat, and it seemed to me that in a certain way there was an eminent practical example in our national politics in which the best of our tradition in terms of a kind of fallibilistic virtue was being violated. Okay, I come to the third point. The third point is this: the community of inquirers and the sociality of practices. And here again, I think Peirce was one of the first to emphasize the importance of the concept of the community of inquirers. For the ways in which we can test the validity of our claims is by opening them to public criticism of others. Again, using a scientific inquiry as an example, and I only mean this as an example, we can say that no hypothesis, no theory will be accepted as correct simply because it is affirmed with absolute conviction. New hypotheses must be subjected to relentless criticism by the relevant community of inquirers. And this is a point that was also made by Karl Popper when he spoke of conjectures and refutations, a characteristic of critical inquiry. He argues that critical inquiry advances through the process of making bold conjectures and then subjecting them to rigorous testing and refutation. And the pragmatists, I think, go even further, for they argue that we are quintessentially social beings in the sense that we're always being shaped. That doesn't mean we're completely determined by the social practices in which we participate. When I turn to the pragmatic conception of democracy, we will see that they reject the very common contrast between the individual and society. Individuality for them is not an ontological or epistemological given. It's rather an achievement. And the quality of the individuality that we can achieve is shaped and dependent upon the type of communities in which we live and thrive. And the quality of the community, its life itself, is dependent on the quality of our individual contributions. There is a circular relation here, but it's not a vicious circularity, but rather a kind of creative circularity. And this leads me to the fourth theme that I want to emphasize: pluralism and contingency. William James argues for a radical pluralism of perspectives. We human beings can never achieve what a later philosopher called a God's eye perspective. In a pluralistic universe, a book based on a series of lectures written in the first decade of the 20th century, this is what he has to say. Again, typically James. It's curious how little countenance radical pluralism has ever had from philosophers, whether materialistically or spiritualistically minded. Philosophers have always aimed at cleaning up the litter with which the world is apparently filled. They have substituted economical and orderly conceptions for the first sensible tangle, whether these are morally elevated or only intellectually neat. They were aesthetically pure and definite, and aimed at ascribing to the world something clean and intellectual in the way of inner structure. As compared with all these rationalizing pictures, my pluralistic empiricism, which I profess, offers but a sorry appearance. It is torpid, muddled, a Gothic sort of affair without a sweeping outline and with little pictorial nobility. Now, pragmatic pluralism is not to be confused or identified with what we might be called a self-defeating relativism. It is an engaged, fallibilistic pluralism. Such a pluralistic ethos, as exhibited by James and others, places new responsibilities on each of us. For it means taking our fallibility and our limited finitude seriously and resolving that however much we committed to our own biases and prejudices and prejudges and styles of thinking, we are willing to really listen to others without denying or suppressing the otherness of the other. It means being vigilant against the dual temptations of simply dismissing what others say, because we already know what it's all about, or falling back on one of those defensive ploys where we think we can translate what is alien and different into our own familiar vocabularies. Reminds me, when I was once at Harvard, I won't mention it, there was a president at Harvard who always had this wonderful expression, "I hear you, Dick." Whenever he said, "I hear you, Dick," I know he didn't understand a word I was saying, you know. Okay, so learning how to really listen. It means being able to expand our horizons, even when this is painful. Such an enlarged, engaged pluralism is hard work, and a task that can never be fully completed. And furthermore, the pragmatists, I think, have a deep sense of contingency. There are and always will be surprises and conflicts in human life. And the pragmatists took contingency and chance to be basic features, not simply of human life, but of the universe itself. We can never completely control or predict what will happen, and consequently, their ideal is to cultivate those habits, virtues, and dispositions that can prepare us for unexpected contingencies and conflicts. Implicit in this view is a world that challenges a classical distinction between theory and practice. The pragmatists always emphasize the agent's perspective rather than that of the spectator. I come to the fifth point, the agent's perspective and the continuity of theory and practice. Dewey not only criticized the quest for certainty, which has characterized so much of the history of philosophy, but he also criticized what he called the spectator theory of knowledge. Much of philosophy, and a good deal of modern philosophy, has been dominated by ocular metaphors, where knowing has been conceived as a form, maybe the highest form, of mental seeing. For example, we presumably can directly see, when we pass beyond discourse, internal forms, or have intellectual intuitions of clear and distinct ideas. But with the rise of experimental science, we should realize that knowing is not just contemplation, but involves active experimentation and problem solving. Knowing is a form of doing. It is an activity. Instead of drawing a sharp distinction between contemplation as some form of higher knowing and practice, we should draw the distinction, as Dewey wrote, between intelligent action and forms of routine practice that are uninformed by intelligence and imagination. And indeed, a philosopher like Dewey wants to see the experimental spirit inform everyday practices. One of the reasons why Dewey was so concerned with education, especially the education of the young, is because he believed that this is the way, and the only way, to develop those critical habits that are so vital for a robust democratic society in which there is genuine experimentation and genuine fallibility. So finally, I turn to the pragmatic conception of democracy. Democracy is a way of life. Of all the pragmatic thinkers, John Dewey was the thinker who was most concerned with the fate and the threats to democracy. And Dewey was a very moral of the public intellectual who not only wrote philosophical books, but during his long life dealt with complex problems of society. In a famous plea, he wrote that the time had come for philosophers to stop dealing exclusively with the problems of philosophy and turn their attention to the problems of human beings. Dewey, going to his career, was a leader of many progressive causes throughout his life, ranging from one of the initiators and founders of the NAACP to the American Civil Liberties Union. For Dewey, democracy is primarily not a form of government, but rather what he called an ethical way of life. He conceived of democracy as a way of life in which all can potentially contribute and all participate. When he was 80 years old, in an address entitled Creative Democracy, the task before us, this is what he wrote. Democracy is a way of life controlled by a working faith in the possibilities of human beings. Belief in the common man is a familiar article in the Democratic Creed. This belief is without basis and significance, save as it means a faith in the possibilities of human nature exhibited in every human being, irrespective of race, color, birth, family, of material and cultural wealth. This faith may be enacted in statutes, but it's only on paper, unless it is put in force in the attitudes which human beings display to one another in all the incidents and relations of daily life. Dewey had an enormous faith in common people, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, or education, and their capacity to actively participate as democratic citizens. And at the same time, he was always wary and critical of the threats of democracy. And what he took to be the greatest threats to democracy are internal ones, not external threats, not from foreigners. He argued that rapacious, laissez-faire capitalism was undermining real democracy. I have no doubt if Dewey were alive today, he would be outraged about the current political situation where money seems to rule our political life and distorts our democratic institutions. Now, before passing to the narrative, I'm going to do it quickly, of the decline and the contemporary resurgence of pragmatism, I want to tell an anecdote about John Dewey. For me, you see, philosophy is concrete. If you really want to understand philosophy, you have to also understand the people who philosophize too. What are they like? What are their existential crises? What are their fears and so forth? And this story about John Dewey sort of epitomizes, to me, his principles and his character. Some may know that during the 1930s, the infamous Moscow purges took place. These were trumped-up legal proceedings in which Stalin was purging virtually everyone who was not one of his loyal supporters. And although the famous Leon Trotsky was already in exile, he was viciously attacked in the Moscow trials as an enemy of the people. In 1937, Trotsky was living in exile in Mexico, in the house of Diego de Rivera and Frida Kahlo. A number of intellectuals who were sympathetic with Trotsky and felt that the Moscow purges were outrageous asked Dewey if he would lead a commission to investigate the charges that Stalin had brought against Trotsky and his son. At the time, there were many liberal thinkers in America who were deeply sympathetic with the Soviet Union and felt that Stalin was justified in attacking his enemies. Tensions were so high that Dewey's life was threatened. His friends and his family pleaded with Dewey, he who was 78 at the time, not to make what was then an arduous trip, this is before airplanes, to chair the commission. But Dewey, who practiced democratic principles, those that he professed, felt it was his obligation to go and to lead this commission. It was important that the world should know the truth. I find it both moving and consistent with his character and his philosophy that Dewey concluded his opening remarks of the first session of the commission in Mexico with the following personal declaration. This is what he wrote. Speaking finally, not for the commission, but for myself, I had hoped that a chairman might be found for these preliminary investigations whose experience was better fitted for the difficult and delicate task to be performed. But I have given my life to the work of education, which I have conceived to be that of public enlightenment in the interest of society. If I finally accepted the responsible post that I now occupy, it was because I realized that to act otherwise would be false to my life's work. It's a wonderful statement. The following September, the Dewey Commission issued a summary of its final findings and included, I quote, "We therefore find that the Moscow trials to be frame-ups. We therefore find that Trotsky and Sedov are not guilty." Now here's where Dewey is even more admirable. After the publication of the commission findings, as I say, the attacks on Dewey became even more vicious. He was called a fascist, a tool of reaction. A letter appeared in Communist Journal, The New Masses, signed by many prominent American intellectuals, warning that Dewey was a dupe to the Trotskyites. But Dewey, the radical Democrat, stood up and for fairness, for justice, and for truth, even though he strongly disagreed with Trotsky's political thinkers. Despite Dewey's role as a leading progressive, I should tell there's an after to this thing. I'll be very brief about it because I don't want to go on forever. That afterwards, Dewey and Trotsky had an exchange, an intellectual exchange, in which Dewey, it's a short, but one of the sharpest things that Dewey ever wrote, attacking Trotsky. He was in sharp disagreement with Trotsky's ideas, particularly about means and end, but he certainly felt, as you might say, as a committed radical Democrat and liberal, that it was important that the truth be known. So it had nothing to do with the sympathy with Trotsky's views. Now, despite Dewey's role as a leading progressive pragmatic thinker, pragmatism as a kind of philosophical movement began to rapidly fade from the American academic departments. During the 1930s and 40s, there was a growing influence of the emigre philosophers who had fled from Nazism. And many were associated with the Vienna Circle and with logical empiricists. And later there was a strong influence in the United States of the Oxford style of ordinary language analysis on philosophers in America. From the late 1930s until the 1960s, there was in effect a quiet but radical revolution in academic philosophy departments in the United States. And this is the period in which one can begin to date the dominance of what's called linguistic analytic philosophy. Indeed, it's the time that the infamous, and I think it is infamous, Anglo-American continental split in philosophy was becoming entrenched. So what happened to pragmatism? The classical pragmatists were marginalized. They were viewed as fuzzy-minded thinkers who may have had their hearts in the right place, but they lacked the clarity, precision, and analytic finesse to do serious philosophical work. Pragmatism seemed to be relegated to the dustbin of history. It's still a sad commentary, I think, on American academic philosophy departments that one can get a PhD in philosophy today without having ever read a word of the classical pragmatists. But beginning in the 1970s, there were signs of a change and the beginning of a resurgence of pragmatism. And one of the key figures in helping to make pragmatism respectable again was Richard Rorty, During the 1960s and early 1970s, Rorty had written some excellent articles at the cutting edge of analytic philosophy and was edited a famous anthology called The Linguistic Turn. He was sufficiently popular among hardcore analytic philosophers that he was elected president of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association at a relatively young age. But when he published his famous, some would say infamous book, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, it caused something of a sensation. He shocked many of his fellow philosophers when he wrote in his introduction that Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and Dewey were the three most important philosophers of the 20th century. Continental philosophers might agree about Heidegger, as analytic philosophers might have agreed about Wittgenstein, but virtually no one at that time would put Dewey in the same league, the same category. Now, from that time on, Rorty identified himself with the pragmatic tradition of Dewey and James, although his version of pragmatism was extremely, and still is to this day, controversial. But like James and Dewey wanted philosophers to stop dealing with the old, worn-out problems, and he sought to foster a new spirit of creative experimentalism. And Rorty was also important for another reason. He was one of the first to see that actually was more continuity in American philosophy than had been acknowledged by many others. He argued that such thinkers as Quine, as Sellers, and Davidson, who were typically thought of as leaders of the analytic philosophy, and all had taken the linguistic turn, were actually developing pragmatic themes of the classical pragmatist in new and more sophisticated directions. And another thinker of Rorty's generation who contributed to an appreciation of pragmatism was Hilary Putnam. If ever there was someone who was originally identified as a hardcore analytic philosopher, it was Hilary Putnam. He was a sophisticated philosopher, he is, of physics and mathematics, and he was educated by the leading philosophers of logical empiricism, including Hans Reichenbach and Rudolf Carnap. But gradually, like Rorty, Putnam found that the confines of the analytic tradition were too narrow, and he too began to identify himself with the pragmatic tradition. In an article entitled Pragmatism and Moral Objectivity, this is what he writes. What I find attractive in pragmatism is not a systematic theory in the usual sense at all. It's a certain group of theses which can and indeed were argued very differently by different philosophers with different concerns, which became the philosophies of Peirce and, above all, James and Dewey. Cursorily summarized, those are: 1, anti-skepticism. Pragmatists hold that doubt requires justification just as much as belief. 2, fallibilism. Pragmatists hold that there is never a metaphysical guarantee to be had for such and such a belief that will never need revision. And then he puts in parentheses that one can be both fallibilistic and anti-skeptical is perhaps the unique insight of American pragmatism. 3, the thesis that there is no fundamental dichotomy between facts and values. And 4, the thesis that in a certain sense, practice is primary in philosophy. Now, I want to briefly mention 3 other thinkers who were graduate students when Rorty was a professor of philosophy at Princeton, and who were deeply influenced by him and who have made distinctive contributions to the resurgence of pragmatism. Cornel West, Jeffrey Stout, and Robert Brandom. Although Cornel West is well known as a public intellectual, deeply concerned with the problems of race in America, what is less well known is that one of his great sources of inspiration was the classical American pragmatic tradition. His first book was a survey of this pragmatic tradition, and John Dewey turned out to be one of West's great heroes, primarily because he showed how philosophers could illuminate the practical issues of everyday life. Jeffrey Stout, whose works in the field of religious studies has developed a concrete understanding of what democracy means today that is very much in the tradition of Deweyan pragmatism. But perhaps the most ambitious advocate of pragmatic orientation is Robert Brandom. Brandom sees virtually all modern philosophy movements since Kant as converging towards normative pragmatism, a pragmatism where rational norms are implicit in discursive social practices. Indeed, Brandom speaks not only about American pragmatism, but of Heideggerian and Wittgensteinian pragmatism. And he most closely identifies himself with Hegelian pragmatism. Now, even if one has some skepticism or doubts about this global approach to pragmatism, Brandom has an important insight. He reads much of the philosophy during the past 2 centuries as converging on pragmatic themes, especially on how social practices shape who we are and how these practices can be improved. Although my own views are intellectually more modest than Brandon's, I basically agree that we can read what is too frequently taken to be radically different philosophical orientations as converging on pragmatic themes. And that's what I tried to show in my book, The Pragmatic Turn. Okay, I'm coming to the end. Now, thus far, I've been emphasizing the significance of pragmatism for American philosophers, but I want to indicate the international scope of pragmatism by briefly discussing the work of Jürgen Habermas. Habermas is certainly the most famous German philosopher alive today, and he plays a role in Germany as a public intellectual that really corresponds to the role that John Dewey played in the United States. Since the end of the Second World until the present, as the successor of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, he has been a strong spokesperson for a radical democratic vision. And when Habermas speaks on a public issue, every educated person in Germany, and Europe too, I think, is aware of his voice. He has been and continues to be, I think, the democratic conscience of Germany, and indeed of all Europe. But from his earliest days, he has had a deep respect for and has been deeply influenced by the classical American pragmatists, especially Peirce, Dewey, and George Herbert Mead. And he now identifies himself as a Kantian pragmatist. He thinks that the pragmatists introduced a major paradigm shift in philosophy, from the philosophy of consciousness or subjectivity to a communicative, intersubjective model of human action and rationality. Several years ago, Habermas was asked, quote, "What do you see as the most lasting contribution of..." Sorry. I'm sure that'll get on the internet. Okay. He was asked, what do you see as the most lasting contribution of the tradition of Western pragmatism and social thought? And this was his reply. Alongside Marx and Kierkegaard, pragmatism emerged as the only approach that embraces modernity in its most radical forms and acknowledges its contingencies without sacrificing the very purpose of Western philosophy, namely, to try out explanations of who we are and who we would like to be as individuals, as members of communities, and as persons in general. That is, as a human being. Now, there are resonances in Habermas's remarks that connect with comments that I quoted at the beginning of my talk by Louis Menand about how the pragmatic thinkers changed the way we think about education, about democracy, about liberty, about justice and tolerance. And many of the pragmatic themes that I've been discussing are integrated into Habermas's philosophical orientation. Finally, let me conclude. When I wrote my dissertation on John Dewey in the 1950s, believe it or not, it's what my children refer to as the Middle Ages, interest in Dewey and pragmatism seemed at an all-time low among academic philosophers. The pragmatists were thought to be passé, to have been displaced by the new linguistic turn in analytic philosophy. I felt then, and continue to believe, that Peirce, James, Dewey, and Mead were really ahead of their time, that they were initiating a sea change in philosophy. I have had the good fortune to have my original intuitions vindicated. I have lived through and modestly contributed to the resurgence of a pragmatic orientation. Philosophers throughout the world are catching up with pragmatism. Today, there is a much more vigorous, extensive global discussion of the multifaceted aspects of pragmatism than at any time since its origins in the latter part of the 19th century. The persistence and the cosmopolitan vitality of pragmatism are emphatically present in the world today. Thank you. We have a, sure.
Question about 20 minutes, so if you have a mic, just raise your hand and we'll call on you for
So at the beginning of your talk, you seem to allude to, I guess we could call like a semantic slippage between philosophical pragmatism and the modern usage of the word pragmatism as, I guess, expediency. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Is there an abuse of that term going on as well?
Yeah, well, the use of the term pragmatic, I think, actually even preceded in the common. I mean, let's do a little bit of analysis of semantics and about origins. As I quoted from James, the term really comes from a Greek term, from pragma, which means like ordinary things. And it's closely associated also with the Greek term praxis. In some ways, I think contemporary philosophical pragmatism is much closer to the way in which Aristotle uses the term in praxis. The Peirce himself really picked up the term and used the term from Kant's anthropology, where Kant speaks about a kind of pragmatic philosophy. Now, you know, like any common uses and so forth, there is a certain aspect of, even in the common use, that captures something that I think is in the pragmatic thinkers, that is being flexible, being aware of the kind of tradition, but the suggestion that somehow it's not principled, that it's only expedient, that it doesn't take responsibly ethical and norms, that is all a kind of betrayal of, I think, what these thinkers. And I mean, what's so ironic, particularly with someone, well, it's true of James too, but Dewey, is that these were great critics of vulgar pragmatism. These were great critics. I mean, Dewey thought that, you know, the materialistic tendencies in America, particularly having to do with what he thought was the heritage of laissez-faire capitalism, was undermining what was best in America, its democracy, so that you have a kind of battle and a tension between, you might say, this high sense of pragmatism, this philosophical sense, and although you can see, I mean, if you're stressing flexibility and if you're stressing adaptability, then that's okay. But if it's unprincipled, against ideology, and indeed relativistic, that is completely antithetical, I think, to the best of these thinkers. And I should say something else. I mean, in the lecture you can't talk about everything. The pragmatic thinkers extend much further. One of the things that I mentioned towards the end, Mead, but one of the people who had a tremendous influence, I mean, and now there are women who are working on this, is Jane Addams, who was very closely associated with Dewey, and Dewey worked at her famous Hull House. And Addams, who, if you don't know, you all ought to know about, who ran this, and won the Nobel Peace Prize, had a great influence on the shaping of pragmatic, particularly as they related to democratic themes.
Could you speak a little bit to the notion of inquiry as it relates to problem solving?
Yeah. Well, I think that this is, well, two parts of the question. I think that this is fundamental in terms of Dewey. That, I mean, and in essays like How to Think and Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, he gives a kind of structure of what he sees as analytic stages in terms of inquiry. And the first stage, putting it informally, is a felt difficulty, or what he calls an indeterminate situation, a sense that something is not right. He then makes the next point, which is that then you have to search for figuring out what is the problem in this. I mean, I always like to use the kind of example which, I always admire people who really know about cars, but suddenly I'm on the highway driving on the freeway, and it stops, and I have the foggiest idea what's going on. And in a way, there's a clear, indeterminate situation, and somebody who's got expert knowledge can begin to figure out whether it has something to do with my electrical system or something, the fuel pump or something like that. And then with this, he sees a kind of dialectic of between that and solutions, that it suggests certain hypotheses. And says at this point there's got to be a certain inquiry. You could use the example of figuring out what's going wrong with your car as a paradigm for what he has to do, and then testing the hypothesis to see if it really works. Now, Dewey's claim is that that structure, which I just did, and we can do in a simpler sense, which is then initiating a problem, figuring out what the problem, and solving the problem, becomes a kind of almost paradigm for all inquiry, whether it be political inquiry or social inquiry, etc. So that's the way it would work for him.
I was wondering if you could say just a bit more about the distinction between skepticism and fallibilism.
Yeah, fallibilism. Yeah. Look, I mean, the history of skepticism is a very interesting topic. I was using it in a way in which it has tended to become entrenched in modern thinking, where it is that a condition of, it's taken as one of the conditions for the possibility of knowledge that what you claim to know is true, okay? So therefore, are you ever in a position to really claim that you know something is true? The argument will then go, I'm giving it a very simplified way, if you're not in a position to know that it really is true, then you're not in a position to claim that you know anything, okay? Now, we can then it can be worked out in very sophisticated ways about how knowledge is justified true belief, etc. I think, and this is still deeply entrenched. It seems, I mean, surely there are many contexts in which if I say I know X, and then tomorrow I discover it's not true. I know I saw Phil's children today in Beloit, and I claim that I know this, and now I see the evidence that one of his daughters is really down in Rice in Houston. I would then say, well, I didn't really know it. I thought I knew it, and so forth. So that is a kind of standard paradigm. But if carried to extreme, then you're in a kind of position, if you cannot have a kind of criteria for absolutely knowing that something is true, then you're forced to the skeptical conclusion that you don't have any knowledge, because you're not in that kind of position. Now, I think the pragmatic approach is, look, not to deny that in some cases that is the move, but it's absurd to develop a whole theory of knowledge on the basis of this, to claim that, and it is not the case. First of all, I mean, this is why I use a scientific example. You could say that Newton was wrong. We know that now. Therefore, Newton had no knowledge. Now, one would say that's just absurd. This is not the way it works, that you use a kind of conception of knowledge in which you recognize the fallibility. What is it that we would say about any scientific or any kind of inquiry? It's likely that our knowledge was approximate. We didn't really have it completely accurate. It has to be refined, but that's what knowledge is in this sense. So the fallibilist wants to claim that you are never in a position about any specific knowledge claim to say that you know this with absolute certainty. that there is always the possibility. Now, that it doesn't follow from that I'm not knowing anything or I don't know real. I mean, Peirce put it beautifully. I'm knowing real things all the time. I'm knowing the world, but I don't know them with the kind of certainty. So that I think the pragmatist view is that this view of knowledge that leads to epistemological skepticism is what itself has to be criticized. And furthermore, I think that the other point that Putnam makes is that if you're having what Peirce calls genuine doubt, you have a reason to doubt. You don't just doubt. If something is going to be rejected, you don't think that, then what are your reasons for doubting that this is the case? He wants to make the distinction between what he calls real doubt and make-believe doubt. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for a wonderful talk. I think I have a question. Was it Habermas who said that that there was even a Hegelian pragmatism? Is that right? You were talking about somebody who talked about Hegel as a pragmatist. Is that right?
Robert Brandom.
Yeah. So I guess my question is pragmatism in the way that you're talking about it actually sort of a school of thought, or is it more kind of like a stance that one adopts in practicing philosophy? Because I have to admit, I'm having trouble thinking of Hegel as a pragmatist.
Well, okay, let me explain to you what Brandon means by that. But first of all, I would put it this way. Stance is too weak a word because you have to identify certain kinds of themes, and that's what I attempted to do, to talk about anti-foundation and fallibilism, the importance of the community, the nature of social practices. In the case of Robert Brandom, I'm not prepared to give Brandom's book, Making It Explicit, is 800 pages. What? So I would say go home and read it, or look him up on the internet. But this is what he thinks is a move that's taking place. His claim is that there are social practices, discursive social practices, and that there are norms implicit in these practices which then become explicit. Okay, this is what's fundamental to his own, what he calls normative pragmatism. Well, if that's what you are taking as being sort of fundamental, and there are good reasons for it, then you can see that there are anticipations of this, particularly if you, read Hegel in a certain way. If you read Hegel as seeing, certainly the idea that implicit in many, his language, social practices, we take Hegel's understanding of Geist and its development, and the way in which it will give rise to, and that certain norms begin to generate. Now, if you go one step further, as many new readers of Hegel want to see this as essentially an open process, not something that is closed, then you can begin reading it. I think the more judicious way of putting it is to see that there are themes that are central to the pragmatic tradition and that you can see anticipated in Hegel himself. That would be a better way of putting it. I'm a little bit wary of labels, even the label pragmatist, as if it named a well-defined thing. It's I think, much more loosely connected. But it gives an interest in different, and if you, are you interested in Hegel? No, you don't know. Okay, but I will just tell you this, that there's been a tremendous resurgence of interest in Hegel scholarship, and a good deal of it is centered in the United States. More than in Europe and in Germany now. And many of the leading people who are interpreters of Hegel, like Robert Pippin and Robert Brandom. Pippin is at Chicago, the head of the Committee of Social Thought, and Brandom is at Pittsburgh, and Terry Pinkett has written a good deal on this, tend to read Hegel, stress these themes in Hegel, I think. Okay. Not always calling him pragmatic, but nevertheless reading Hegel in a much more engaged way, which is much more relevant to contemporary discussions. Yeah. But, Brandom says there's Hegelian pragmatism, Heideggerian pragmatism, Wittgenstein, I call that a little bit of cultural imperialism. Yeah.
You're talking about the sort of the decline of the analytic linguistic tradition and the resurgence of the pragmatic tradition,
Yeah.
and you mentioned the Wittgensteinian pragmatism.
Right.
Got me thinking about his early works as opposed to his later works, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, as far as what has been going on
Yeah.
in the latter part of the 20th century and
Right.
early part of this century to sort of enact that.
Right. Let me say this. I think every leading thinker who, sometimes it's called neo-pragmatism. It's a word I don't like. But every leader thinker in what I'm calling the resurgence of the pragmatic tradition has found an affinity with the Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, not the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, but the Wittgenstein of the later investigations. I don't want to get into all kinds of things, because there is something, that you can perhaps, if you know your Wittgenstein, you may have heard things that I've said. You see, if I had really written the book that I wanted to write, it would have been 3 volumes. Nobody reads 3 volumes today, because I would have liked to have traced the themes I'm talking about, not only in terms of Anglo-American thought, but also in continental thought. And I'm going to have an opportunity to speak a Heidegger class, because you read early parts of Sein und Zeit, that many of the themes are just, right? And it's not without warrant that some of the leading interpreters like Bert Dreyfus and Hoagland stress the pragmatic themes in the early Heidegger. Now, going to Wittgenstein. But Wittgenstein himself is calling into question a kind of foundationalism. Wittgenstein himself, is, even if you read something like Uncertainty, and you might think that this was written by a classical pragmatist, dealing with the issues of what we can be certain about, where there is doubt, where there is when you spade, when the things turn over. So all those themes, anti-foundationalism, getting away from a kind of subject for Cartesian. I think for me the clue is this. It would go something like this. I think that what can be a unifying theme in the classical pragmatists, in continental thinking, particularly Heidegger and those influenced by Heidegger, and Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, is that all of them, in different ways, without knowing each other, is what they're doing deeply perceive that there's something wrong with the Cartesian framework. The subject-object friendly, the mental thing, ideas in the mind, and so forth. And each, in different ways, is beginning to not take a position in one of these things, but give a critique of the way of thinking of that. And that critique of Cartesianism, it seems to me, as fundamental to the later Wittgenstein as it is to the early Heidegger, as it is to the early pragmatists. So if you think of Putnam, think of Rorty, think of Habermas, they've all had interest and all see affinities in Wittgenstein. Now again, it's like the answer about Hegel. I don't think, even though Hilary Putnam once wrote a chapter or a book called Is Wittgenstein a Pragmatist? I'm not quite sure that this is a useful question. I would rather deal with, can we see issues and themes and insights fundamental to pragmatism that are really elaborated in these other thinkers? And there I feel fairly confident there you can say yes about both Wittgenstein and Heidegger. Okay.
There's one last question. You talked a lot about the theme of praxis being integral to the pragmatic philosophy, and because of that, it was very
I
important.
can't quite hear you. Could you speak a?
Yeah.
I heard the first part. I talk about the pragmatists doing something.
Yeah, the necessity of praxis in exercising a pragmatic philosophy. And because of that, you even spoke yourself about how important it is to understand the philosopher. his biography and understanding his philosophy, what do we make then of Peirce and his conception of a community of inquiry when he did most of his work entirely outside of the community?
It's interesting that you asked the question. I think this is a great tragedy for Peirce and a great tragedy for America, and that this philosopher who so emphasized the role of a community of inquirers, that's precisely what he lacked. And I don't mean simply in the sense that he was not able to get an academic position and he wasn't really in a community, but there really were even James, who was deeply influenced by some aspects of Peirce, doesn't have a real deep understanding of Peirce. So maybe it's ironical. That's the way I would put it, is that in a way he stresses the importance of a community of inquiry in all areas. That's precisely what he lacked himself. And if we're going to be completely honest, I don't know if you've done much work on Peirce, he suffered as a result. His work suffers as a result. One of the reasons I think that Peirce is still in the shadows for many, many people is because if you want to play the game, you can show he's contradicting himself all over the place. So, there's something, really, he's a deeply systematic thinker in the sense of thinking deep themes and thinking it out, but sometimes Peirce could rewrite an article 20 times and say slightly different things. He's very, very difficult philosopher, really sort of get. With some philosophers, you sort of feel if you really work on it, you're going to crack it. You'll never crack Peirce. After a while, he'll crack you because you've got to start responding to what he has to say. So it marred his thinking. The very fact that he lacked a real kind of community of people actively discussing his kind of work. So since I love to tell stories, and I believe the philosophers should tell stories, that's the way to teach philosophy, I'll tell one about Peirce, which is a wonderful story. It gives something of his character. Here is William James. You saw from his writing, generous, trying to help his friend Peirce. Indeed, what he wanted, there was a visiting professorship at Harvard. He wrote to Charles Eliot, the president, saying, this is the best man in America. The reason why he didn't is because Peirce, there were all kinds he divorced his wife, he was doing the kinds of things that any professor who did today, can be considered an art sort of thing. But at the end of the 19th century, you're living with a woman that you're not married with. It was enough to keep you out of a university. It was still a kind of strong Victorian kind of ethos. So here's James trying to help his thing and arranged for him to give a series of lectures at Harvard called the Lowell Lectures. And now gently to his friend who is, deals with technical things, speak about vitally important topics. Well, Peirce gets a letter from James, vitally important, outraged. What could be more vitally important than the technical aspects of logic? And he gave lectures that nobody in the audience could have possibly understood. That was part of his kinds of perversity. And that's where James made the remark about these lectures. Flashes of brilliance against Crimean darkness. Okay, good. Okay.